3 hours after my husband forced me out into the sub-zero darkness, the kitchen phone rang in the house that used to be mine. It was not me on the line, but a state trooper named Detective Claravance. She informed him that his wife was currently shivering under hospital blankets with a deep laceration on her forehead. A witness had spotted a gray crossover vehicle speeding away from the patch of black ice where I had collapsed. My husband, Arthur, would walk into that emergency room expecting to face an exposed criminal. Instead, he would confront a brutal reality he had deliberately blinded himself to for weeks. But before the flashing lights and the sterile smell of the ward, there was simply a locked heavy oak door. There was a porch light flicking off, and a man I had loved for nearly 2 decades choosing a young man's fabrications over my devotion. I was 50 years old, standing on the frozen concrete in a lightweight cardigan, watching my spouse slide the brass deadbolt into place from the safety of the foyer. The winter gale drove the snow sideways under the awning, biting into my skin. Behind the glass, my stepson, Julian, stood with the relaxed, triumphant posture of a general who had just won a campaign I never even realized we were fighting. "Go away, Eleanor," Arthur shouted through the storm glass, refusing to even open the main door an inch. "I do not want to see your face until every single dollar is returned to the corporate account." "You honestly believe I took that money from you?" I asked, my voice holding remarkably steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline. "I believe my boy," he answered, and those 4 words shattered everything. 18 years of marriage had just been reduced to 4 words on a bitter January night. The temperature had plunged far below the freezing mark, and I was dressed only in slacks, a knit top, and the thin slippers I wore around the living room. My phone, my purse, my winter coat, and even my daily cardiac medication were still inside, resting exactly where I had placed them after work. Julian had methodically gathered my personal belongings earlier that afternoon while I was out, locking them securely in the guest room. He told his father I was preparing to flee the state, claiming that an innocent woman would not have her passport sitting out on the kitchen counter. Arthur swallowed the lie whole, granting me a mere 10 minutes to pack before ordering me out. He refused to let me grab my device, fully convinced I would use those moments to delete the digital trail of a crime I had never committed. I did not scream or beg on that porch. I simply explained as clearly as I could while my jaw began to shake that the bank was already conducting an internal audit regarding the missing funds. I told him I was the one who flagged the transfers. Julian cut off my explanation before I could even finish the thought. "Do not let her manipulate you again, Dad," he urged softly. "She has been spinning this web for months." I studied my husband's features through the glass and realized the trial was already over. He had not asked for my side of the story. He had simply passed judgment and locked the door. I retreated down the steps before he could call the authorities and accuse me of creating a public disturbance. The heavy latch clicked into place, a sound that reverberated deep within my chest. Walking down the dark driveway, the biting wind pierced my clothing instantly, and my slippers filled with frozen slush within 50 yards. My toes grew completely numb, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. I kept my chin tucked down and my arms wrapped tightly against my torso, focusing on the yellow street lamps to keep from panicking. Somewhere past the edge of our neighborhood, the roar of an accelerating engine echoed behind me. Bright high beams cut through the falling snow, moving far too fast for a slick residential roadway. My old training from my days as a corporate investigator kicked in, prompting me to turn and glance at the approaching vehicle. That split-second distraction was all it took for my foot to find a sheet of black ice. My legs swept out from under me, and my temples struck the concrete curb with a sickening thud. The world began to spin and darken at the edges, but my last vision was a gray crossover idling at the intersection. Its red tail lights cast a sinister glow against the white drifts. There was a distinctive indentation along the rear quarter panel that made my stomach twist with sudden dread. Even as my consciousness drifted away, I knew it looked exactly like Julian's vehicle. Did I have no idea how long I remained motionless on the frozen ground. The final detail I recall before total darkness was a stranger's voice calling out for someone to dial emergency services. 3 hours later, the telephone rang in Arthur's kitchen, but the state troopers were not asking for bail money. They were demanding his presence to piece together the wreckage of his assumptions. To comprehend how I ended up on that dark stretch of road, you have to look back 6 weeks. That was the afternoon Julian arrived at our home with 2 duffel bags and a sob story about a mass layoff at his firm. He claimed his partner had abandoned him and that he merely required a temporary sanctuary to rebuild his finances. When Arthur asked if his son could occupy our spare room, I agreed without hesitation because I loved my husband deeply. I remembered how terrifying it felt to struggle without a safety net, never suspecting that I was the one being set up for a fall. Within a fortnight, however, The red flags became impossible to ignore. Julian began taking hushed phone calls in the driveway, lowering his voice whenever I approached a window. He started asking casual questions about the current market value of our property and whether the title was clear. On 2 separate occasions, I discovered him rifling through the filing cabinets in Arthur's study when he thought I was running errands. He began planting seeds in his father's mind, suggesting that I had become overly controlling regarding the household finances. He whispered that I enjoyed keeping Arthur dependent on my salary. Having spent over a decade investigating commercial fraud, my professional instincts kicked in, and I quietly began assembling a comprehensive dossier on my stepson. I discovered a notification showing a bank profile access from an unrecognized IP address. There was a pending request to wire $85,000 to an offshore entity I had never encountered. I even found a sheet of paper in the recycling bin where Arthur's signature had been traced repeatedly, practiced like a school assignment. Furthermore, a sophisticated audio alteration software was active on Julian's laptop, along with heavy transfers out to an online sports book. Instead of triggering an immediate confrontation, which only teaches a sophisticated thief to hide their tracks better, I quietly forwarded the documentation to the institution's fraud division. I secured digital copies of the system logs before they could be erased and reached out to Detective Clara Vance, an old colleague from my enforcement days. I also delivered duplicates of the entire file to my personal attorney, Evelyn Boyd, instructing her to maintain absolute discretion so Julian would not realize we were closing in on him. Unfortunately, I underestimated how closely my stepson was watching me. The moment he realized I was building a case, he decided to strike first with a carefully manufactured narrative of his own. He generated a fraudulent email address using my name and initiated correspondence with a local realtor about a rapid cash sale of our property. He printed a mock listing agreement with my forged signature at the bottom and took a screenshot of the pending transfer, cropping out the status bar so it appeared completed. He even retrieved a vintage timepiece belonging to Arthur's grandfather from my vanity box, a watch I had actually sent out for restoration weeks prior, and left the empty velvet case on display. The most damaging piece of his puzzle was a heavily manipulated audio recording. I had recently spoken with Evelyn about establishing a medical proxy for Arthur after a sudden bout of vertigo that spring. My exact words were that we needed a clear document in place to protect him if he ever lost the capacity to choose. Julian edited the digital file down to just a few damning words. Arthur will no longer have the right to decide. Stripped of all context, it sounded like a cold calculation to seize control of his life. He fed these fabrications to his father gradually, choosing moments when Arthur was exhausted from long shifts at the dealership. Julian utilized an old vulnerability, knowing that Arthur's first spouse had cleaned out their joint accounts before vanishing years ago. He pressed against that unhealed scar until Arthur could no longer see the reality in front of him. On the night everything fractured, Julian laid out his manufactured folder on the dining room table like a seasoned prosecutor. When Arthur demanded answers, he refused to let me review the complete file, presenting only the cropped images his son provided. I tried to explain that I had initiated the bank investigation myself, but Julian countered instantly. Of course she would claim that, he sneered, since the culprit always tries to play the whistleblower. When Arthur brought up the real estate contract, I noted that the property could never be transferred without my explicit consent. Julian seized on that statement immediately, turning my own protective measures into an admission of guilt. "See that, Dad?" he shouted. "She just admitted she thinks the house belongs entirely to her." That was the exact moment Arthur discovered that his name had never actually been added to the property title. His expression shifted from anger to profound humiliation, the specific sting of a man learning a financial truth in front of his child. He stopped listening to my explanations, hearing only a story where he was the victim. The retired medical worker who discovered me on the roadside was a woman named Marion Foster. She had been driving home late when her lights caught a dark shape against the snowbanks. She stopped her car, wrapped me in an insulation blanket from her trunk, and stayed by my side until the emergency vehicle arrived at the scene. She also noted the gray crossover idling nearby and managed to jot down a partial license plate on her palm. At the medical center, the physician diagnosed me with moderate exposure and a concussion from the fall. The moment I regained full awareness under the harsh lights, I requested the staff contact Detective Vance. Clara arrived within 40 minutes, bringing the full weight of her office with her. We reviewed the timeline of events, and the pieces began to fall into place with alarming speed. Security footage from the avenue confirmed Julian's vehicle had circled the block multiple times right around the time I was forced outside. Furthermore, the bank confirmed an unauthorized attempt had just been made to cancel the active fraud inquiry using Julian's primary computer. With the immediate threat of evidence destruction, Clara secured an expedited warrant for his digital devices. She then placed the call to Arthur, instructing him to come to the hospital immediately. When Arthur arrived at the clinic, he found 2 uniformed officers stationed outside my door, along with Evelyn Boyd holding a thick legal folder. On the bedside stand rested his grandfather's vintage watch, sealed inside a clear plastic evidence container. He walked into the room slowly, his eyes wide as he took in my injuries. Clara stepped forward without a word and placed a crystal-clear surveillance photograph from the avenue on his lap. Arthur stared at the image of his own son behind the wheel of the crossover, his face draining of all color. "This cannot be true," he whispered, his hands beginning to tremble as the certainty vanished from his eyes. Evelyn then presented the official repair receipt for the timepiece, proving I had dropped it off a month prior. The jewelry boutique had already provided video showing Julian picking up the item under false pretenses the previous afternoon. He had staged the empty box in my room solely to trigger his father's rage. The financial investigator spoke next, demonstrating that the $85,000 transfer had originated from an old tablet Julian kept in his room. The authorization code had been sent to a burner phone registered in the young man's name, intended for an account controlled by a dummy corporation. Arthur looked at me, his voice breaking as he tried to claim he had only intended for me to stay at a motel for a single night. I asked him where he expected me to go without my keys, my wallet, or a coat in a blizzard. He had no answer, lowering his head as the full weight of his choices settled in. Clara returned from a quick phone call, her expression grim as she revealed what the search team had just uncovered in Julian's quarters. They found a drafted contract transferring the home title into his name, alongside pages of paper where he had practiced forging my signature for the deed. Deep within his desk layout was a newly minted life insurance policy valued at $750,000 on Arthur's life. The sole designated beneficiary was Julian, with an entirely fabricated signature at the bottom. The $85,000 was merely the prelude to a much darker endgame. Julian owed substantial debts to private lenders who were growing increasingly violent, and he had planned to leverage the house to clear his ledger. He had built his entire scheme on the assumption that the property belonged to his father, completely unaware that my sole name on the deed protected the asset from his reach. Clara played the unedited audio clip for Arthur, letting him hear my actual words regarding his health and my desire to protect his autonomy. The silence in the room was absolute when the recording finished. Arthur reached out to touch my hand, but I quietly withdrew it beneath the safety of the hospital sheet. Julian was taken into custody later that morning at a local motel, facing multiple felony charges ranging from grand larceny to identity theft. Arthur sat by my bedside for hours, offering hollow apologies and weeping for the trust he had so easily discarded on our front porch. I did not offer him forgiveness that morning, nor did I return to the house once the medical staff cleared me for discharge. The locks were changed again, but this time, I was the one holding the keys to my own future while he moved into a small apartment near his dealership. Standing on that icy porch taught me that 18 years of history can vanish in a single second if a person is looking for a reason to doubt you. I survived the freeze, but the warmth of our marriage was gone forever, left behind on the black ice of that January night.